Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the shadows. Not the shining halls of kings or the clamor of battlefield glory, but the quieter places. The alleys behind the tavern, the candlelit corners of a scriptorium, the still rooftops at midnight where someone waits in silence, knife in hand. Tonight we're talking about the medieval assassin, a figure as feared as they were misunderstood. Not always noble, not always skilled, often cold, hungry, and always alone. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who's listening around the world, who's relaxing, who's drifting off, who's still wide awake. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let everything around you settle into quiet, because we're about to follow a man who walks where no one dares to follow. Congratulations, you've been chosen. But you'll have to move carefully, because you are a medieval assassin. You wake before dawn, not in a bed but on a pallet of straw. The damp smell of old wood and cold stone rises around you. Your breath curls in the air. You slept in your boots again. You are nobody. At least that's what you tell people. But people don't ask many questions when your eyes never smile. And your job isn't glory. It's waiting, watching, and disappearing. There's no cloak and dagger romance here. No hooded leaps from cathedral towers. There's just hunger, aching knees, and the knowledge that one mistake, just one, means the end. Your tools are simple: a narrow knife, slim and dull-colored, a cord of waxed twine, a small vial, mercury or something like it, tucked inside a piece of bread hidden in your satchel. You're not paid in gold. You're paid in silence, sometimes in food, occasionally in information, a name to avoid, a back door to use, a stable that won't ask questions. The guild doesn't care about your comfort. If there's a guild at all, you've heard whispers of a network, maybe monks in disguise, maybe nothing more than fearful peasants exaggerating a tale. You travel alone, always alone. You sleep in barns and cellars in places too dark for rats. There is no honor in your work. No one sings songs of your success. In fact, the best days are when no one knows what you did at all. Your hands are always cold. They don't sweat anymore. You've trained that out. The knife doesn't tremble when you hold it. Your breathing is slow. You've stood in the rain for hours, waiting for a door to open. You've eaten dried peas from a cracked bowl while pretending to be a wandering farmhand. You've been beaten for asking directions in the wrong accent. You've bled from bites, from splinters, from places no one notices. On tonight there is a name. A merchant who knows something he shouldn't. Or perhaps a scribe who saw something he should have burned. You don't ask why, you don't need to. You only need to know where and when and how. You slip into the street just before curfew ends. The lamps are low, only the night watch walks now, and they don't see you. You move like fog, in between torchlight, beneath the eaves, through a passage carved between two crumbling walls. You do not run, you do not rush. You breathe and you think, how much longer can you do this? Not because you're soft, but because you've begun to forget what it's like to speak plainly, to walk into a room without looking for the exits, to sleep in daylight. You wonder if this name, this target, might be the last. You almost hope it is. Fun because even the best assassins don't retire. They vanish one day, they just stop returning. Segment 2. The Kingdom That Held Its Breath. A failed assassination in the court of England. The candle gutters, its wax pools on cold stone. You are alone in the corridor. Somewhere beyond the wooden door, the future of a kingdom lies sleeping. It is the year 1327, and the air inside Nottingham Castle is thick with tension, like a bow drawn too long. The king is a boy, 15 years old, crowned too early, watchful far beyond his years. Edward III. He sits on a throne inherited through shadow, not by battle, not by succession, but through quiet betrayal. His father, Edward II, has been deposed, removed not by rebellion but by his own wife, Queen Isabella. She is called the she-wolf of France, elegant, clever, unforgiving. Her companion and rumored lover, Roger Mortimer, pulls the strings now. The young king is a figurehead, a pawn in a game he's only beginning to understand. And outside the walls, the people stir. And it's in this charged, uneasy quiet that someone, somewhere, decides that the boy must die. No grand declaration, no army raised, just a message passed hand to hand. A name whispered in an alley. A purse placed on a table, a door unlatched, and a night chosen. When the corridors of Nottingham Castle are narrow and cold, guards pace the great hall, their eyes heavy with sleep. Not careless, but used to the sameness of night. It has been weeks since anything changed. A figure slips past the gate, through a servant's tunnel, perhaps dressed in the plain wool of a groom, or the rough cloak of a stableman. No weapons visible, none needed, not yet. A short blade hidden in a sleeve, or perhaps a wire knotted with bone. Something silent, something final. The boy sleeps alone apart from his chamber guard. An aging knight whose best days lie far behind him. The door creaks slightly as the latch turns. The assassin steps inside. But something changes. Maybe the candle sputters at the wrong moment. Maybe a foot catches a fold of cloth. Maybe Edward stirs, half dreaming, and calls out for water. Or perhaps the killer hesitates, sees not a king but a child. A breathless moment, the faintest flicker of conscience. We'll never know. But the blade does not fall. Instead, the figure retreats. A breath caught, a plan unraveling. A life spared, though not for mercy. The next morning, the castle wakes to silence. No alarm, no dead king. But something has shifted. In the rumor spreads quickly, an attempt. An intruder, a failed killing, not proven. Not written down officially, but whispered in the halls and inked into the margins of private letters. Mortimer's hand begins to tremble. Not visibly, not publicly, but in the privacy of strategy, he knows. The boy is not safe, and a frightened king grows into a dangerous one. On the days that follow are brittle. More guards, more keys. Locks changed, servants replaced. Mortimer tightens his grip, and in doing so sets his own fall in motion. For Edward remembers, he does not forget. By the next year he strikes. Swiftly, quietly, he arrests Mortimer in the dark, pulls him from the heart of the court and tries him with brutal efficiency. The verdict is clear: treason. Roger Mortimer is executed, publicly, without ceremony. Drawn, hanged, quartered, his body displayed as a warning, though few speak the words aloud. The she-wolf loses her fangs. Queen Isabella is confined, her influence broken, her son now fully a king. And Edward? Edward becomes the monarch history recalls with admiration. Strong, capable, calculating. But beneath the crown, always remembering the night the door opened and the blade did not strike. And as for the would-be killer, no name, no grave, no execution, only silence. A ghost in the records. Someone who stood over a sleeping king and walked away. Sometimes history turns not on blood but on hesitation. Not on power but on the things left undone. A single night, a single breath, a single kingdom, held together by the quiet decision of someone who never stayed to explain. Segment 3. The Order of the Green Door. An assassin's network that may have never existed. There are some names in history you will not find in ledgers. No birth certificates, no coats of arms. Just rumors, scratches in margins, and stories passed quietly between frightened lips. One such name, if it can be called that, is the Order of the Green Door. You won't find it in the official records of any medieval court. No chronicler ever lists its members. No bishop denounces it outright. Yet somehow it appears not often, just enough, a phrase in an intercepted letter, a carved symbol on a wall, a story told in 3 cities years apart, by people who could not have known each other. Always the same phrase, the Green Door. Some say it was a brotherhood. Others claim it was a marketplace, a shadow economy of knives and poisons where anyone with enough coin could buy silence or arrange a disappearance. Its supposed origins are vague. Perhaps the Rhineland, perhaps southern France. Perhaps the outer districts of Bologna, where university students vanished after crossing the wrong families. Theories abound. A traveling alchemists' guild turned violent. A band of disillusioned monks with sharp convictions. A network of tavern keepers and message boys. Each one passing names along in whispers, never knowing the full shape of the web. No 2 accounts agree, but they all speak of the door. Green painted, unmarked, hidden among dozens of others on a narrow street. In a different city each time, never the same. They say if you found it and knocked just once, someone would answer. Not right away, not warmly, but someone would answer. And behind that door, names changed hands. Lives were measured in coin, and deaths were arranged as quietly as ordering bread. And it sounds like legend, it probably is. But then again, there are gaps. Murdered officials with no suspects. Court advisors who vanished without a trace. Monks found dead with strange markings beneath their robes. Symbols that match no known script, but resemble the patterns carved into a beam in a burned-out wine cellar in Avignon. These aren't patterns you stumble across. They're choices, intentional. careful, familiar to someone. A papal scribe once recorded a passing line in a letter from the Archbishop of Cologne. "We believe the matter is settled. The green door is closed for now." No context, no follow-up. The letter ends with a prayer. The scribe's own notation in the margin is even stranger. If the door opens again, send no names. It is possible the green door never existed. A myth born from fear, a catch-all for unexplainable things. But medieval Europe was no stranger to networks the powerful refused to acknowledge. Spy rings, priestly informants, secret brotherhoods who helped slaves escape, or kept forbidden texts in the roots of hollow trees. Is it so strange to think that somewhere, beneath the normal hum of medieval life, someone was making lists, writing them carefully, trading names for coin, watching, always watching from behind the green door? We don't know who they were, or if they ever truly breathed, but the shape of them remains. A ghost of a pattern, a door painted green, behind which no records survive, only a silence too specific to ignore. Segment 4. Perfume, Power, and Paranoia. Living with the Fear of Assassins. You sit in a great hall lined with banners. High above, wooden beams arch like the ribs of some slumbering beast. Torches flicker behind colored glass. A trio of minstrels plays soft, deliberate music in the corner. Not lively enough to dance to, but just enough to keep the silence from swallowing the room. You are a nobleman, a duke perhaps, or a count, or a royal advisor whose power comes not from blood, but from closeness to it. You wear velvet cuffs stiff with embroidery, a ring on every finger, each one heavy, each one sending a message. You do not eat the roast boar first. You wait, a servant takes a bite, then the taster, then you. It's not a habit, it's a necessity. Because death here doesn't come in the form of charging armies or rival lords with drawn swords. It comes in subtler ways, a poisoned fig, a cup that smells faintly of almond, a blade dipped in nightshade, tucked behind a brocade curtain. Assassins are real, you've heard stories. Everyone in court has the wine steward who vanished overnight, the maid who was found in the fountain, hands stained with ink, the archbishop who died mid-sermon, face pale, lips blue. No suspects, no trial, just silence and a change in tone among those who remained. Wait, so you adapt not openly, but quietly. You eat only after the food has cooled. You never drink from a cup poured by an unfamiliar hand. Your servants are watched by other servants. And those servants, by you. You keep dogs, not for company, but because they bark at strangers. You wear a hidden charm, a small vial of powdered unicorn horn or something sold as such, tied beneath your shirt, just in case. The windows of your chambers are barred from the inside. Your bed is high, curtained on all sides. You sleep in the center of the room, not near the walls, not near the door. No fireplace. Too many hiding places in a hearth. No tapestries too easy to conceal behind. Only clean, bare walls, and a single dagger tucked beneath your pillow. You haven't had a restful night in years, but that is the price of your station. And when guests arrive, you welcome them with warmth and calculation. You note how many retainers they bring, how long they stay, whether they eat what you serve. You know the signs of someone hiding a secret. You've seen enough bodies lowered into the ground, wrapped in too much silk to disguise the fear in their final days. Sometimes, late at night, when the hallways are silent and even the hounds have grown still, you wonder, not whether someone is coming, but who it might be. Will they slip in through the scullery? Through the servants' hall? Will it be someone you once called friend? Or will it be someone you've never seen? A coin passed in a tavern, a face glimpsed only once before the light goes out? The irony is not lost on you. You have built walls, you have hired men, you have studied poisons, mapped escape routes, burned letters, and still, you are not safe. No one in your position is. Not truly. Not when fear sleeps in the bed beside you. Not when a knife can be bought for a pouch of silver. You sip your wine, just a taste. The musicians have stopped playing. You hadn't noticed, and the room suddenly is quiet again. Segment 5, The Poisoner's Trade, A Life Built in Silence. You were not born to this. No child says, I wish to be the bringer of invisible death. But the world has many ways of shaping the forgotten. You were perhaps a servant, a cook's helper, a washer of floors in a monastery too proud to learn your name. You learned to move quietly, to watch from corners, to listen through doors that never quite shut. And then one day someone noticed you, not with kindness, not with cruelty either, just recognition. An older woman perhaps, dressed plainly, unremarkable, but her fingers smelled faintly of almond even in winter. She asked you to fetch a plant. Belladonna, she called it, just a bit, only the berries. She taught you to crush them, to dry them without drawing attention, to mix the powder into warm broth, never cold, never with fat. You asked no questions, you were told not to, and from that moment on your life began to narrow. You became a student of death, not the grand sweeping kind. Not battlefields, not gallows, but the kind that takes days. That starts with a stomachache, a cold sweat, a dry tongue. You watched people crumble quietly, too slowly to be saved. You watched the suspicion grow like mold in a damp corner, and you watched how it passed, not toward you, never toward you, because you were no one, still just the servant, still in the background, still invisible. You learned other recipes, a dried mushroom mixed with goat's milk, a pinch of arsenic and sugared fruit, crushed glass and softened cheese. But your favorite, your quiet masterpiece was the ink poison, made from green vitriol and vinegar applied with a feather. It dried invisible. And days later, when the reader licked a finger to turn the page, that was all it took. Not quick, never quick, but certain rare, your life became small. A rented room, always near a place that sold herbs. You kept no friends, you rarely spoke. You never stayed long in one city. 2 years in Tours, not 3 months in Ulm. Half a winter in Bruges. Each job came as a note, sometimes slipped beneath your door, sometimes left in the hollow of a tree. Once you found it folded inside a crust of bread at a public market. There was no signature, just a name, a location and a sum. You never asked why. You never returned to check. There is no guild for poisoners, no society, only rumor. You've heard whispers of others. A widow in Florence, a monk in Wittenberg who brews strange wines, a traveling midwife with red hands and no known parish. But you have never met them. And you would not want to. Their existence makes you vulnerable. Better to be alone, safer, cleaner. You do not like questions. You never work close to home, if you can call any place that. You dress plainly, change your name often, speak with a lilt you don't remember learning. And when people ask what you do, you smile and say, I'm a writer. Because that's close to the truth. You leave behind nothing but ink and silence. But the silence grows. And now, after all these years, it begins to press in. You have no past, no letters, no heirlooms. The coins you've earned sit untouched in a cloth sack, enough to live 3 lifetimes. But you do not spend freely. You do not own land, you do not linger. Even your face has grown unfamiliar in mirrors. You've lived a dozen lives, and all of them alone. Sometimes, late at night, when the street is quiet and your hands have stopped trembling, you think of the first one. The cook's helper, the child with no name. And you wonder, what would they have chosen if given a choice? But that was long ago, and the cup is already poured. Segment 6. Knots, Coins, and Candle Smoke. The Hidden Language of Medieval Assassins. There were no instruction manuals, no formal schools, no coat of arms embroidered with daggers and oaths. But there was a system, or so the whispers claim. A way of passing knowledge and danger without leaving words behind. Not speech, speech could be overheard. Not letters too easily traced. But symbols, simple things hidden in plain sight. A coin placed heads down on a windowsill. A scrap of linen tied around a gatepost with 3 knots. A broken reed set diagonally across a threshold. None of these meant anything to the average eye. But to the right person, to the one watching, they meant everything. Some believed assassins marked time with candles. Not just for hours, but for the very moment of the act. A green beeswax taper burning at dusk left on a certain sill. That meant the blade falls tonight. A blackened wick placed in a bowl of water. Target escaped. Do not follow. Nothing written. Nothing spoken. Just quiet flame. And ash. They used scent, too. Not perfume too strong. But oils. Clove, myrrh, crushed sage. Left in handkerchiefs, on doorknobs, or folded into messages that contained no words at all. If you picked up a scroll and it smelled faintly of lavender, you knew. You were being watched. If it smelled like crushed bitter almonds, you left the city before sundown. And then there were the knots. This, many believe, came from sailors or perhaps traveling performers or midwives. A single rope tied in 5 twists, then looped once around the wrist. That meant I've completed the job. 2 knots tied close together with a 3rd dangling apart. That meant there is a new name. Knots were left in places where they would eventually be found. On bedposts, on gate latches, on the strings of abandoned parcels. You could miss them easily. Most did, but not everyone. And then, of course, there were gestures. These were rare, only used in person. Only when silence wouldn't suffice. A tap of 2 fingers to the temple. I know who you are. A flick of the thumb across the nose. I decline the job. Hands clasped behind the back with palms facing out. I never arrived. Some claimed this language of the hand came from an old guild of beggars. Others say it originated in the courts of Sicily, where nobles used it to direct guards without speaking. Either way, it found its way into darker circles, and once learned, it was never forgotten. And the objects, too, spoke. An empty wine bottle placed beside a full one. A feather laid across a basin. A pair of gloves turned inside out, placed carefully in the center of a table. Each one had a meaning. Each one carried a message, but only to those who had been taught the code. To everyone else, it was just clutter, just coincidence, just a peculiar detail that didn't quite matter. But it did. Because in a world where speaking meant exposure, and writing could bring death, these small acts were the lifelines of survival. A whole language, without words. But the knowledge of it fades now. Little of it was written down. Much of it died with the ones who used it. But sometimes, in old letters and quiet corners of forgotten cities, you find traces. And if you know what you're looking for, you can almost see the conversation, still unfolding centuries later, in knots and coins, in silence and smoke. Segment 7. Below the City. The Hidden Roots of Medieval Assassins. There are 2 cities in every city. The one above, loud and visible, and the one below, hushed, forgotten, and always damp. You enter not through a gate, but through a crack in the side of a ruined bakery. Behind a collapsed stairwell, there's a grate, and behind the grate, a drop it stinks. Not of death, but of old stone and things that no longer have names. You slip in, feet pressed to slippery brick, hand gripping a rusted pipe for balance. The air grows cooler. Not cold, just still, and as your eyes adjust, you begin to see what few ever do. Well, it isn't a sewer exactly. Though it carries runoff, and worse, it's older than that. Roman, perhaps. Laid when the town was still an outpost, long before it became a seat of bishops or kings. The walls are thick with moss and carved with symbols that make no sense now. Spirals, dots. Crude faces scratched with iron nails. No one patrols here, no records mark it. And yet it runs, beneath homes, beneath markets, beneath chapels. Right up to the bishop's residence. These tunnels weren't built for assassins, but they were used by them. A narrow passage connects to a latrine pit. Another leads to the cellar of a merchant's house where dried meat hangs like forgotten flags. And there, beneath one of the beams, you find a groove worn smooth. The rope has long since rotted, but the mark remains. A signal once tied, then pulled away forever. Wait, you move through the dark like a thought. No light, except for the flicker of your candle. Even that is shielded by your hand. Your ears do the seeing now, drips, scurries. A pipe groaning above where someone shifts in their sleep. You could be directly under a feast, a prayer, a secret, and they would never know. So not all tunnels were this old. Some were newer, dug by grave robbers or smugglers or monks building wine cellars no one was meant to visit. In Paris, they say there was a stairway hidden beneath the west wall of the old court, one that led into the drainage tunnels below Notre Dame. In Prague, a disused well connected the kitchens of a noble house to the vault of a chapel. The assassin simply climbed up with wet boots and dry hands. Some of these stories are exaggerations, but not all. Some maps show brickwork that ends abruptly with a note. Passage sealed in 1348. Sealed not because it collapsed, but because someone used it too well. And what of escape, always part of the plan. An assassin did not move through tunnels without knowing the exits. The way the current flowed, which chamber led to the tannery, which led to the river. You might kill in the Archbishop's hall at midnight, but if you could reach the old mill by dawn, you were already gone, wet, cold, and anonymous once more. These underground paths were never safe. They flooded, they collapsed. They teemed with disease. But they didn't ask questions, they didn't gossip. They didn't remember faces, only footfalls, and only for a moment. Then silence again. Segment 8, The Unseen Ones. Disguises and false faces of the medieval assassin. You pass through the gates at dawn. The guards glance at you, then past you. You're nothing to them. Just another figure in the shuffle of market day. A beggar woman. shawl heavy with the dust of a dozen villages, or a journeyman tanner with stained sleeves and a waxy roll of hides, or a monk silent, robe patched at the hem, head bowed not in piety but in calculation. You are not the same person you were yesterday, and tomorrow you won't be this one either. That's the point. In medieval society, identity was rigid and yet surprisingly easy to fake. There were no passports, no photos, no fingerprinted seals. Just clothes, posture, speech. If you knew how to speak like a cooper, walk like a novice, and carry yourself with the weariness of a traveling friar, you could go nearly anywhere, as long as you knew when not to be seen. The best assassins weren't cloaked in shadows. They were cloaked in assumption. The kitchen boy, the washerwoman, the stable hand brushing straw from a boot, all overlooked, all forgettable, all perfect. A stable hand carries a blade to cut tack. A washerwoman handles garments. A novice monk is allowed near the abbot, and no one questions silence. Some became performers, not jesters too visible, but traveling musicians, the kind hired for feast days and weddings. Their instruments hollowed in parts to hide vials, their belts laced with bone needles, their songs tuned not to please but to measure time, one verse to pass the guards, one to move behind the pillar, one to strike just as the final note fades, and others posed as pilgrims, wearing the scallop shell of Santiago, the patched cloak, the weary expression of those chasing redemption. Pilgrims were common and no one remembered them. They came, they prayed, they left. It was the perfect role, and sometimes the perfect cover for watching. Some even carved symbols on their walking sticks, codes disguised as devotional marks, names, times, locations, and no one thought twice. There were costumes within costumes. A beggar might also be a war veteran, limping convincingly, groaning with theatrical pain. An old woman leaning on a stick could be a boy of 17 with ash on his cheeks and leather padding beneath his skirt. A healer could be a poisoner, a midwife, an extractor, a candlemaker, the carrier of secret messages hidden in wax. Each mask was disposable, each name burned as easily as parchment. Some even used disease as cover. A touch of soot on the face, a damp cloth wrapped around the head, a quiet mutter about the illness in my bones, and people cleared space in the street. In this way they could reach their target untouched. Feared but not inspected. Of course, the danger was always there. One misstep, a gesture too confident, a word spoken with the wrong accent, and the illusion shattered. The guards remembered. The steward became suspicious. The crowd looked twice, but most of the time they didn't. Because the truth is, people don't see what they're not looking for. And no one looks closely at the servant carrying the firewood. Segment 9. Before the Blade. How a medieval assassin prepared to kill you wake before dawn, not in a bed, but on a mat of reeds in a rented room above a cooper's shop, where the walls smell of old wine barrels and mildew. Your boots are already on. You slept in your disguise. There is no time to waste on comfort. Today is the day. But before any blade is drawn, there is work to do. First, the confirmation. You check the message again. The note smudged from your handling reads only, Feast of St. Leonard, just after the bell. North wall. You've read it 100 times. There is no other information. There never is. The rest is your burden. You move through the streets with care. Not quickly, that draws attention. Instead, you stroll like a merchant between sales, or a scribe with no urgent parchment to deliver. Your eyes scan everything, the guard rotation at the gates, the traffic of carts through the alleys, the beggar who was not there yesterday. Most important, the entry and exit points, the north wall. You've already walked it 5 times this week, counted every handhold in the old stone, noted the scaffolding for repairs, listened to how the wind moves when the bell rings. You know exactly where the guards pause when the noise overwhelms their ears. That moment, that breath of chaos is yours. And then comes the body, not your own, the one you're meant to take. You know his name, you've watched him twice. Yesterday from a bakery window. 2 days before from the cloistered courtyard behind the chapel. He walks with a hand on his chest even when he's not ill. He favors his right leg, and he always pauses before stepping into doorways. Cautious, predictable. That helps you, but it also warns you. Men who pause before doors often have enemies already. You make a final checklist. Escape route. Through the kitchen garden, over the wall behind the baker's coop, then into the alley where the blacksmith's apprentices smoke pipe leaf they don't think anyone notices. Weapon, a slim blade, sharpened not for fighting. You don't fight, but for slipping between cloth and rib. No blood if done properly, just a soft sigh, and a life ending with no time to speak. Distraction, the bell, the feast. The arrival of the bishop's men. A moment of celebration and confusion, all time to cover your passing shadow. And finally, you breathe. You spend the hour before not pacing, but still. Stillness is the skill no one teaches. You kneel palms flat, breath slow, no thoughts of revenge, no memory of old names. Only the step, the motion, the strike, the retreat. Like water poured into a bowl, like silence filling a room. Some days you don't go through with it. Some days the target doesn't arrive or the moment never opens. When that happens, you leave, quietly, without emotion. You do not grow impatient. That is the weakness of amateurs. You return the next day, or the next, or not at all, because you are not the storm. You are the wind behind it, moving unseen. And when the moment finally comes, the bell ringing, the guards turning, the target crossing beneath the worn archway, there is no sound. Only motion, only stillness after, and then you are already gone. Segment 10. Blood and Benediction. Religion in the life of a medieval assassin. The church bell rings long before the sun rises. You hear it even from the slums near the tannery, where most would sleep through anything but the sound of dogs barking. But not you. The sound of a bell, whether it tolls for mass or death or warning, is something you've never ignored. This morning it means something else. Confession. The chapel is small, older than the street that curls around it. Its door leans slightly and the wood is warped from years of rain. No one guards it, it needs no guarding. The place belongs to God and the forgotten. You enter without a sound. You don't bless yourself with holy water. Not because you lack respect, but because you know not to draw attention. You slide into a pew near the back. Not in the shadows. Shadows draw suspicion. Just still. One shape among others. The priest drones in Latin. His voice echoes. You let it wash over you. You're not here for absolution. You know better. You've sent men to the dirt who were fathers, priests, confessors themselves. You've whispered apologies into empty rooms. But still, there's something in the ritual. The scent of beeswax and old stone. The scrape of the censer. The tiny cough from someone hiding in their own shame 3 pews ahead. This place is like a well. Not because it cleans you, but because you can drop your guilt into it and never hear the splash. And some assassins were deeply religious. There are records and fragments of journals, confessions made under torture, letters never sent. They wrote of patron saints, of prayers recited before each job, of rules they imposed upon themselves. Never kill on holy days. Never touch a priest. Always carry a relic. One, it said, carried a splinter of bone in a linen pouch. Claimed it was from Saint Sebastian. He kissed it before each task, then put it away without looking back. Others believed they were doing God's work. In times of crusade and inquisition, some saw their targets not as men, but as threats to the divine order. A merchant accused of heresy, a scribe who printed ideas too freely, a noble suspected of consorting with forbidden texts. In their minds, the blade was not vengeance, it was judgment. And the hand that held it? Only an instrument. But there were darker devotions, too. Whispers of those who didn't kneel in churches but made offerings elsewhere. At crossroads and caves, at the foot of gallows, the kinds of places where the wind changes too quickly and animals fall silent. They'd leave coins, blood, odd trinkets, dolls with no faces, a mirror buried upside down. Not for saints, but for something else, something old, and watching. Yet for most it came back to silence. A moment before the act, a breath held. A word whispered not for forgiveness and but for focus, not forgive me, but let my hand be steady. Because even for those without faith, death is never casual. It marks you, and no matter how cleanly you vanish, through tunnels, through smoke, through lies, part of you remains behind, kneeling in that cold pew, listening to a prayer you do not believe in, but need to hear anyway. Segment 11. When the blade missed, the punishment of failed assassins. You hear the chains before you see them, rust grinding on rust, the cough of damp air through a narrow corridor, a smell that clings to the back of your throat, part rot, part iron, part something deeper, like the scent of memory trapped in old stone. You've been brought below the court, not to stand trial but to be unmade, because you failed. There was no mercy for assassins, no appeal to honor, no quiet execution. To strike at a nobleman, a bishop, a king, and fail, that wasn't simply a crime. It was treason, blasphemy. It was a wound against the order of things, and the order knew how to respond. Records from across Europe speak in low, careful tones about such punishments. A man in Bruges, caught scaling a servant's quarters with a blade in his boot. A woman in Toulouse found with poison sewn into her sleeves. A scribe in Krakow discovered with notes outlining a duke's movements. None were killed quickly. That would have been mercy. Instead, they were studied, displayed, made into examples. When England, the punishment for regicide was brutal by law. Hanged, drawn, and quartered. Not all at once, each step slow, deliberate, hung until near death. Cut open, bowels drawn out while the heart still beat. Then the body carved into quarters, sent to the corners of the kingdom. But that was for those deemed important. Assassins didn't always receive that attention. Lying in the cities, the punishments varied, and were often public. The square would fill by noon, children lifted onto shoulders, vendors selling roasted chestnuts and cheap wine. The prisoner brought out hooded, barefoot wounds already blooming from earlier, questioning. They might be placed in an iron cage suspended just high enough to dangle, left there until the body stopped moving. Sometimes days, sometimes weeks. The townsfolk would pass underneath, blessing themselves or spitting or simply not looking at all. In Florence, it was said the punishment for silent killers was silence returned. A man caught with a dagger beneath his robe had his lips sewn shut, his tongue removed, and his fingers crushed one by one. He was left to sit on the cathedral steps, a sign hung from his neck. I had nothing to say. Now I say nothing. They say he lived 4 more days. They say he wept. They say he smiled. But no one agrees. Others were turned into warnings, displayed with the tools of their failed trade. A blade bent, a rope frayed, a vial shattered. In Lübeck, a woman was paraded through the streets with bells sewn into her skirt, forced to ring as she walked, the sound announcing her disgrace to every ear. She was not executed, not immediately. They wanted her to live with the sound, to be remembered not for what she did, but for what she failed to do. Not and so fear became the quiet companion of every assassin. Not fear of death, that was expected, but of the in-between, the moment of capture, the time spent in a dungeon that smelled of wet rope and old rust, the names you might say under pressure, real or imagined. Because even the best break eventually, that's why you planned your escape first. That's why you chose poisons not just for others, but for yourself. A hidden capsule sewn into a collar, a tiny pouch tucked in the seam of your belt. One bite, one swallow, and silence forever. Segment 12. Hired, used, forgotten. The clients and betrayals of medieval assassins. It always began the same way. A message delivered in silence, slipped into a satchel, tucked beneath a wine cup, or handed over with a loaf of bread that was still warm. It never said your name, only a time and a place. You knew what it meant. They needed you. Again. The meeting took place somewhere anonymous. A tanner's back room, an apothecary's storage cellar, a monastery garden just before matins when the world was gray and still unformed. They did not introduce themselves. No titles, no handshakes. You were not meant to ask. Only listen. The target might be a rival merchant, a cousin with too much ambition, a priest who had been seen in the wrong company, a noble with dangerous leanings toward reform. Often the language was carefully chosen. He has become inconvenient. The council prefers silence. This is to preserve peace. They never said kill, but you understood. They offered coin, sometimes land, sometimes protection, and sometimes they offered nothing at all, only a threat. Do this and your brother keeps his tongue. Refuse and the past comes back with a name. And some clients believed in discretion. They burned the notes, changed their routes, spoke only once. Others were careless. They talked too loudly, drank too deeply, tried to offer you extras, a better dagger, a horse, a new identity. You never took them, because those were the ones most likely to turn. Betrayal came in many forms. A client might alert the city guard just before the job, claim ignorance, pretend they'd heard something, feared something, and when you were caught, they wept. Why would he do such a thing? I was nearly killed myself. I knew nothing of it. And the guards believed them, because they wore rings and you wore blood. Worse were those who paid, and then erased you, silently, cleanly. A second assassin, a tipped guard, a poisoned coin. Some believed that if you killed once, you might speak twice. So they silenced you before you could even consider it. You would complete the task, walk to the appointed place for payment, and find nothing. Or worse, someone already waiting. Someone with your face drawn on a scrap of parchment and a knife hidden in his belt. There were rare clients who remained loyal. A widow seeking justice. A monk with secrets too dangerous to protect by prayer alone. A prince playing a longer game. They met you once, paid in silence, and disappeared forever. You never heard from them again. And that was how you knew they were the safest kind. You learned not to trust the ones who smiled. Not to drink the wine poured by noble hands. Not to follow instructions too precisely. Because often the real trap was at the end of the correct path. So you varied, watched, and sometimes you left before the job was ever done. Because survival wasn't just in the blade, it was in knowing when a job felt like a noose. Segment 13, Into the Fog. How assassins disappeared from history. Imagine it. You've done the job, the mark is dead. The city is waking, but you're already across the bridge, boots damp with dew, face hidden by the low morning fog. And then, nothing. No record of you enters the town's ledger. No artist paints your likeness. No monk copies your deeds in the abbey scrolls. Your life, so recently a blade against the throat of history, vanishes, as if you were never here. And this was an accident. It was the craft. Medieval assassins didn't leave memoirs. They didn't boast. They weren't celebrated in song, at least not under their true names. The best ones, the ones who lasted, were forgotten. By design, official records mention them only indirectly. The death of Lord Anselm unexplained. Found with no sign of forced entry. No witnesses. No suspects. A bishop dies suddenly during Mass. A merchant vanishes from a locked room. A noble child grows up with a different guardian than expected. And the chroniclers move on, because the story wasn't supposed to stay. But occasionally a name surfaces. A fragment in a letter. A footnote in a court document. A confession forced under torture, where a man claims he worked for a priest or a brotherhood or something darker still. But these glimpses are like candlelight in a long hallway, flickering, unreliable. Sometimes what they illuminate is real, sometimes a shadow of something never there. There are also the false stories, legends. The assassin who leapt from a bell tower, vanished in a plume of smoke. The woman who poisoned a king with a kiss. The blind monk who killed a prince with only a walking stick. These tales survive because they thrill. Because they give face and flair to a figure the world never truly knew. And yet, sometimes behind the exaggeration there is a shape. A kernel of truth. You see it in the timing, in the gaps between events, in the sudden rise of one family after the fall of another. Cause without a traceable cause. Disappearance was also a form of protection. Many assassins didn't stay in cities after their jobs. They melted into the countryside, became brewers, monks, boatmen, took new names, raised children, and buried their tools in the forest behind the house just in case. Some joined mercenary bands. Others vanished into pilgrimages they never meant to complete. They died old perhaps, or younger than planned, but quietly, and no one ever asked what they had been before. Even today, historians speculate. A letter from a German baron dated 1343 mentions a man with no tongue who knew every turn of the castle. A French court ledger lists an unexplained payment to the Black Rose for services rendered. A Venetian logbook notes a ship boarded by a woman with no luggage and many scars, disappearing into the east. And then the ink stops. The page turns. They were never meant to be remembered. They existed between the lines. Changed history in the places where history left no mark. No statues, no ballads, just echoes. And if you listen closely enough, beneath the rustle of old parchment and the footfalls of kings, you might hear them still. Segment 14. The blade beneath the cloak, tools of a medieval assassin, you do not carry much. A pouch of coins, a bundle of herbs tied in twine, a flask of watered wine. And something else, something small, tucked into the fold of your belt, the hem of your sleeve, the hollow between your shoulder blades. A blade, but not one for fighting. You're not a soldier. You're not expected to survive a duel. Your weapons are for one moment only. And after that, you vanish. The dagger is your most faithful companion. But it does not gleam. It's not the kind poets write about. It's short, often no more than 6 inches. Blackened with ash or pitch, its grip wrapped in leather, softened from years of sweat and time. It doesn't shine in the sun. It doesn't reflect candlelight. That's the point. Some prefer curved blades, made to slip between ribs, beneath collarbones, through chainmail gaps in the armpit or groin. Others carry stiletto-style points, thin, narrow, made not to slice, but to pierce deeply and quickly. It's not about blood, it's about silence. Then there are the poisons, distilled from roots, fungi, venom, carried in tiny glass vials or soaked into pins, or mixed into powders that cling to the rim of a goblet. Nightshade, monkshood, hemlock. Or subtler ones, those that mimic illness. Slow the heart, blur the vision, kill a man over days, leaving no sign of foul play. Some even carried hollow rings. Twist the base. A drop into the wine, no scream, just stillness. Concealment was the craft within the craft. A blade hidden in the sole of a shoe. A garrote wound into the lining of a belt. Needles sewn into hems, fine enough to break skin as you brush past in a crowd. One favorite, a wax-sealed scroll tube with a compartment at the bottom. Not for parchment, but for a coiled wire. Light enough to carry, strong enough to silence. Even more important than the weapon was the casing. Clothing chosen to hide movement. Layers that did not rustle. Colors that faded into shadows. Grays, dusky browns, washed-out blacks. Pockets built into cuffs. Sleeves with slits for quick withdrawal. Hats that could obscure the brow and eyes. Boots made to muffle steps, sometimes with bits of wool packed into the sole. You carried yourself not like a warrior, but like someone who had nowhere to be, someone always in the background. Then there were tools not for killing, but for getting close. Lockpicks often disguised as hairpins or tools of trade. Chalk to mark a door or warn a partner. A broken seal to forge a false document. A strip of fabric soaked in vinegar to mask scent when passing through alleys thick with refuse or rot. And sometimes, just sometimes, a disguise so complete that the blade was never even drawn. Because the true tool of the assassin was the lie. Segment 15. One strike for a kingdom. Political assassination in the medieval world. You are brought in through a side gate. No guard looks at you. No one speaks your name. You carry no blade, nothing suspicious. You walk like a servant or a monk, or a boy with a message from the stables. But every step you take is a thread tugged loose from a royal tapestry, because tonight a prince will die. Political assassination in the medieval world was never spoken of directly, and rarely recorded as such. Officially, kings died of fevers, princes fell from horses, lords were caught by accidental arrows on the hunt. But behind those words was often a face like yours. Calm, forgettable, carrying no weapon but time, access, and instruction. Sometimes it began with ambition. A younger brother eager for the throne, a noblewoman whose family had been passed over, a bishop who feared reform. They would find someone like you, someone invisible. They'd offer wealth, a new identity, safe passage to another land. But what they truly offered was danger disguised as opportunity. The target could be anyone at the top. A duke nearing a treaty, a queen rumored to carry the wrong blood, a chancellor who knew too much. And when the plan succeeded, the death framed as natural or pinned on a common thief or never solved at all. The entire balance of power shifted. Sometimes subtly, sometimes catastrophically. Take, for example, the suspicious death of Prince Edric of Northumbria in 1071. He was young, healthy, due to marry into a rival family. He fell ill after a feast. Only his cup was untouched by others. The wine-bearer vanished that night, never seen again. A rebellion broke out weeks later. Coincidence, said the records, but the pattern is familiar. Riti, or the tale of the Venetian doge Enrico Dandolo. Old, powerful, he died suddenly in Constantinople. The only physician who attended him disappeared the next day, taking a ship east, never to return. Dandolo's death paved the way for a quiet, internal restructuring of Venetian leadership, one that benefited exactly one family. You don't have to dig deep to suspect a hand behind the curtain, and in some cases the assassin didn't act directly. They provided a map, an unlocked door, a list of names. Sometimes their job was to watch, to confirm the target's habits, to create a gap in routine wide enough for another to slip through. And if they succeeded, they left before the bells rang. But political assassination came with risks no coin could balance. If discovered, you were not executed. You were erased, tortured until names spilled like water. hung in public not just to die, but to be displayed, left on city walls for months, a warning that no ambition goes unnoticed. Still, some viewed it as service, as correction. They didn't see themselves as killers, but as keepers of the order, ensuring the right blood remained in power and the wrong blood did not spread. They believed kingdoms could be shaped by quiet hands, by a single night's work, done well. And perhaps they were right. Segment 16. The Brotherhood in the Shadows. Secret orders and hidden guilds, you meet them at night. Never in the same place twice. Sometimes in the back room of a candlemaker's shop. Sometimes in an old wine cellar, where the casks are empty but the walls still smell like years of quiet conversation. They wear no uniform. They carry no symbols. And yet you know them. You're one of them. Throughout the medieval world there were rumors of guilds formed not for trade but for death. Some operated like families, others like cults, a few like businesses. What they shared was structure, a system. You weren't just taught to kill. You were trained, indoctrinated in some cases, to survive, to listen, to obey, and above all, to never speak. Out in Italy, these groups were sometimes mistaken for mercenary bands. But real mercenaries fought in the open. The brotherhoods did not. They operated within cities like Florence and Milan, close to power but never too close. You might be a scribe by day, a baker's apprentice, a clerk. By night, you answer to someone known only by an alias, the reed, the lark, uncle, or simply the man upstairs. And in Paris, a supposed guild known as La Main Grise, the Grey Hand, was whispered about in court circles. No one had ever seen them, but nobles occasionally died quietly, discreetly, in ways that made the Grey Hand seem more than rumor. A lord who fell into the Seine with no witnesses. A young duchess who died in her sleep, poisoned, they said, by the corner of a letter. And always a strange silence that followed the death. No one was ever arrested, no one confessed. The Grey Hand was not questioned, because it wasn't even confirmed to exist. Other orders were said to be more structured. You started as a runner, then a listener, then a watcher. Only when you proved yourself did they give you a name. And with the name came a task. And with the task came risk. You might be paired with a mentor, someone old who had already killed and lived to walk home. Or you might be sent alone, a test. The first kill was never for pay, it was for trust. And their codes were unwritten but strict. No names, no real addresses. Never return to the same place twice. Never speak the name of the client. Never ask about others. And if caught, you carried a false name, a false past. And if need be, a quiet end tucked into a ring or flask. Some of these brotherhoods did more than kill. They gathered information, acted as spies, protected certain families in exchange for coin or loyalty. A city-state might look peaceful, but beneath the surface, two rival families employed their own silent networks. One move, one mistake, and the blade whispered back. Others leaned into ritual, initiations with fire, pledges made over graves, symbols carved into walls in places no one looked. A curved line meant safety. A jagged mark warned of betrayal. A red thread tied around a wrist that meant you were marked and time was short. Were all of these brotherhoods real? We can't know for certain. Some stories come from torture confessions, hardly reliable. Others appear in margins of ledgers, letters sent in code, legends passed down by those who claim to have once known someone who knew. But what is clear, absolutely clear, is that many assassins survived longer than one job. They lived within systems, not just skill but structure. Not just knives, but networks. Segment 17, The Woman Who Slipped Through. Female assassins and silent operatives. She is not what they expect. She moves through the streets in broad daylight. A basket of herbs on her hip. A quiet nod to the baker. A familiar touch on a child's head. No one sees the stiletto in her bodice. No one suspects the letter she delivered last night sealed a nobleman's fate. She is invisible. Not because she hides, but because they never looked for her in the first place. And in the medieval world, women were everywhere and but rarely seen. They served in taverns, tended to the sick, worked markets, and passed unnoticed through city gates, kitchens, cloisters. It was this invisibility, social, cultural, strategic, that made them perfect for certain kinds of work. They were ideal carriers of secrets. There are records, scattered and spare, of women implicated in quiet killings. A midwife in Prague who may have administered something bitter to a baron. A seamstress in Lyon whose customer never woke. A widow in Valencia who was hanged for a crime against the church, though no details were ever released. These women moved through spaces no man could enter. They were in bedrooms, beside cradles, in kitchens, and near the dying. They could be trusted, which meant they could not. Poisons were their most common tools, tucked into rings sewn into sachets, folded into the petals of dried flowers, or mixed into tinctures that eased sleep. Some used belladonna, deadly in drops. Others knew hemlock, foxglove, ergot, and they rarely stayed to watch it work. The victim passed days later, and she had already changed her name, her hair, her town. Not all of them worked alone. Some were part of larger networks. Quiet branches of noble households, women trusted to deliver messages, run errands, tend to private matters. In some families, the wife was the true strategist. She identified threats, she arranged the solutions. She didn't wield the blade. She chose the hand who would. Other women used seduction, not as dramatized fantasy, but as calculated entry. A glance, a word, a quiet drink shared, and then the door opened. The target's guard dropped. The poison was in the wine, or the blade in the boot, or the door left unlatched for someone else to slip through. And in rare cases, the woman herself delivered the kill. One story from Sicily tells of a nun who disappeared for 3 days and returned with blood beneath her nails. Never questioned, never caught. A record from Lübeck describes a merchant's wife found at the center of a violent rearrangement of estate succession. But the truth is, most female assassins were never recorded, or if they were, it was under other names. Herbalist, witch, temptress, midwife. They erased her. Not because she wasn't important, but because she was too dangerous to remember. And still she existed. Moved through rooms no one else could. Changed the course of families, cities, lineages, all without leaving a blade behind. Only a whisper, a silence. A gap in the story no one could quite explain. Segment 18. The Mountain Shadows. The Hashashin of Alamut and the Making of a Legend. The castle sits impossibly high. Alamut, eagle's nest, cut into rock, surrounded by cliff faces so steep they seem to fall away from the sky itself. It is not visible until you are almost upon it, and by then, it is too late to turn back. This is not the palace of a king. It is a school, a sanctuary, a trap, and for those who trained here, it was the only home that mattered. The Nizari Ismailis, a Shia Muslim sect, founded this hidden stronghold in the late 11th century under the leadership of Hassan Isaba. But to outsiders, they were not a sect. They were something darker, a brotherhood, a cult, a network of silent killers. Crusaders feared them, sultans hired them, and later tried to destroy them. But for nearly 200 years, the Hashashin endured. And what they left behind was a legend both terrifying and strangely elegant. Their methods were precise, calculated. They did not engage in open war. They chose targets carefully, always men of influence, viziers, military leaders, princes. Each assassination was meant to shift political pressure, not sow chaos. To make rulers think twice, to force respect through fear. And when they struck, they often did so publicly. In a mosque, at a banquet, in the middle of a crowded street. The message was always clear. We can reach you anywhere. They trained with care. Initiates underwent years of study, not just in weapons, but in philosophy, languages, disguise, movement, and most of all, patience. An assassin might wait months, years even. Some entered the household of their target as a servant, a scribe, a stable hand. They waited, they observed, and when the time was right, they acted. And then, they did not flee. Many stood still and waited for execution, or took their own lives on the spot. Because death was not feared. It was woven into their purpose. European chroniclers, encountering this terrifying precision, did what chroniclers often do when they cannot understand. They told stories. Wild ones. That the assassins were drugged before missions, entranced by gardens of paradise and promised pleasures beyond mortal imagination. That they were under the spell of a man who could command minds. That the word Hashashin came from hashish, the drug of fools and zealots. But most of that was propaganda, constructed by enemies. By outsiders afraid of an enemy who did not play by their rules. There is no proof they used hashish. No reliable account from within confirms it. The idea stuck because it was exotic, alarming, easy to repeat. And from it we get the modern word, assassin. Their downfall came slowly. The Mongols swept through the region in the mid-13th century, leaving few stones urburned. Alamut was captured, the Brotherhood broken, the surviving assassins scattered into mountains, Cities, legends. Some say the line never ended, that a few cells survived, moving in silence even now. But that too may be a story, one the assassins themselves would have approved of. What remains of them today is this: a reputation, a shiver in the margins of old scrolls, and a name that became larger than the people who once bore it. The Hasheshin. Not madmen, not fanatics, but planners, thinkers, and killers, all in the name of an idea. Segment 19, Sanctified Silence, the Assassin and the Church. The stone chapel is cold. You kneel not in reverence but in waiting, your head bowed, your hands folded as if in worship. The priest approaches quietly, his eyes unreadable. He does not ask your name. He already knows it. He sits. There is no cross between you, only a list, and a name that needs to disappear. Unto the outside world, the church in the medieval era was the very image of peace. It forbade murder, it preached mercy. It claimed to be above the squabbles of kings and cities. But behind monastery walls, politics thrived. Bishops were power brokers, popes were kingmakers. Monks copied not just holy texts, but records of land ownership, debts, and succession. And when a certain abbot or inquisitor became inconvenient, solutions had to be found. Quietly. Sometimes the church was the target. Assassins were hired by nobles who feared excommunication, or who resented church taxes, or who wanted to seize a monastery's land for their own gain. Priests poisoned at dinner, friars who drowned mysteriously in the monastery well, a bishop who fell from the bell tower, though no one could explain how he'd gotten there after Vespers. The church called these acts heresy, blamed witches, blamed political rivals, but it did not always seek justice. Sometimes it simply replaced the body and moved on. But in other cases, the church was the client. There are whispers, persistent, chilling, that certain churchmen employed assassins to handle threats too delicate for open judgment. A noble refusing to recognize papal authority, a monk spreading dangerous ideas, a woman too well liked for someone accused of heresy. Inquisitors could burn you in public, but sometimes they needed someone to remove the problem before the fire, before questions were asked. One letter, preserved in the Vatican archives but only referenced obliquely, speaks of a servant of the sword who rendered a debt settled in the eyes of God. Another record from Avignon mentions an external correction carried out at night, requiring no confession afterward. These terms sound vague, euphemistic, but to those within the inner circle, they meant something very specific. A death arranged, blessed buried. And it wasn't always formal. Sometimes it was a rogue cleric, a cardinal with enemies, a bishop with secrets, a payment made in relics, not coins, a false absolution, a safe house beneath a cloister, and when it was done, the assassin was granted passage across borders, shelter in abbeys, even penance for the act. It had been necessary and so forgiven. Yet the church was not comfortable with this shadow. There are signs that some orders, particularly the Benedictines and Dominicans, grew uneasy with these arrangements. Council records hint at external actors being discouraged. Papal bulls issued quietly, condemning secular intervention in sacred disputes. But old habits die slowly, and some halls of power preferred the shadows. The relationship between assassin and church was one of contradiction. Sanctity and silence, guilt and absolution, a denial written in ink and an order given in whispers. To kill for the church was not holiness, but it was sometimes permitted, especially if it protected the institution. Segment 20, When the Knife Misses, the fate of the failed assassin. You ran, but not far enough. The guards found you at dawn, hidden beneath a cart of firewood outside the city gate. Your cloak was torn, your hands bloodied, your blade missing. You had tried to disappear into the morning mist, but someone saw, and someone talked. Now you are bound, not in rope, but in intent. A failed assassination was more than a personal disaster. It was a disruption of the entire social order. Because killing a noble, a bishop, or even a well-connected merchant was not just a crime. It was treason, it was blasphemy. It was a reminder that the powerful could bleed. And so the punishment had to be more than justice. It had to be memory. Public execution was the most common fate, but not swift, not clean. In 13th century Cologne, a man accused of attempting to poison a wealthy textile lord was paraded through the streets barefoot, his tongue nailed to a board, before being dragged to the city gates and burned alive. In Florence, a failed assassin was sewn into a sack filled with stones and tossed into the Arno. It was said to send a message not just to others, but to the river gods. No, but some deaths were drawn out as civic theater. A scaffold built in the marketplace. A crowd summoned like for a festival. Children sat on shoulders, vendors sold bread and spiced wine. And at the center of it all, you, stripped, named, displayed. Your crimes read aloud, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes invented entirely. And then came the punishment, broken on the wheel. Hung in an iron cage, left to starve, or quartered limb by limb as the bells rang out. Why such cruelty? Because a failed assassin disrupted more than one life. He revealed weakness, he challenged hierarchy. He reminded the people that power could be touched. So his body had to become a warning. His failure, a legend. But not all were killed. Some were interrogated first. Inquisition-style questioning, stretching. Fire, blades, not to punish, but to uncover who had hired you. What you had learned. Whether you were part of something larger. And sometimes, if you answered well and gave names and begged sincerely enough, you were not executed. You were used. Turned, made into an informant. Sent back into the world with new orders, a new master, a new knife. But no loyalty. Once you failed, you were owned. By fear, by debt. By whoever let you live. In rare cases, the assassin vanished. Not by escaping, but by being disappeared. Imprisoned beneath a keep, locked in a monastery cell. Or quietly killed and buried without name or marker. Because a failed assassin left questions behind, and questions that were dangerous. And some say the worst fate was not death, but shame to be broken in the public square. To be remembered only for failure. To die not as a ghost but as a spectacle. Because a successful assassin vanished, but a failed one lingered. In memory and nightmares. In warnings. Segment 21. The art of moving unseen. Stealth, balance, and body discipline. You do not run. You glide, your feet know where to land without sound. You count the creaks in the hallway planks. You time your breath with the turning of the guard. Even the wind is your accomplice. There's no magic in it, only training. And in the assassin's world, your body is your first and final tool. Dixie, from a young age, if you were lucky enough to be taught, you learned how to carry yourself like someone who belonged. Not to look sneaky, that was too obvious. Instead, to look forgettable, to match the stride of a scribe, the stance of a novice monk, the slouch of a laborer just finishing work. The most effective disguise wasn't a costume. It was posture. Balance was everything. You trained by walking narrow beams across empty courtyards, by climbing low walls without shifting loose stones, by learning to fall quietly. You practiced landing from heights by bending the knees, dispersing the sound through muscle and breath. A harsh landing could alert dogs. A slip on slate could echo in alleyways. Even your clothing was tailored, tight at the ankles and wrists to avoid snags, silent to the touch, neutral in color. There were drills for movement, timed crossings of candlelit rooms without flickering a flame. Tests where you crossed courtyards blindfolded, only by memory and sound. Some schools taught their initiates to match breath with the rhythm of someone nearby, to move when others moved, to cough when a door slammed, to blend in not just in appearance but in sound. In cities, you studied terrain like scripture. Which staircases creaked, which doors never latched, which alleys connected behind markets and taverns. You memorized escape routes. Always three. One fast, one hidden, and one that doubled back. Because pursuit was inevitable. And when it came, you ran only if you could vanish. Otherwise you stopped, blended into a crowd, changed your gait, adopted a limp, held a basket like a washerwoman, picked up a child and became a father for 10 steps. Adaptability was your armor. The hands mattered too. They had to be steady. You practiced holding them flat against walls while listening through stone. You trained to draw a blade silently, to twist it free of a sleeve, to tuck it away while smiling in the face of suspicion. Hands could betray nerves, so they had to become actors. Night vision was nurtured, not assumed. You learned to see in candlelight, to sense the difference between shadow and movement. You followed cats through alleyways. You watched how they moved and mimicked. And when darkness was total, you counted steps. You felt air temperature shift as you neared open windows. You used smells, the sour of a kitchen, the metallic edge of a blacksmith's forge, to locate yourself. You were a creature of outlines, not details. Your heartbeat had to slow on command, because the moment before the kill was often when panic rose. You trained to lower it, to breathe without sound, to wait, And when the moment came, to move without hesitation, because hesitation made noise. It made tension in the muscles. It made mistakes, and even retreat had its rituals. An assassin did not simply flee. They shut windows silently behind them. They scattered sand to mask footprints. They left red herrings. A cloak tossed in the wrong direction, a fake blood trail, a door forced open far from the real escape. And then they vanished, not with speed, but with certainty. Segment 22. The Contract. How medieval assassinations were commissioned. You don't meet your employer in a tavern. There are no loud toasts, no whispered deals over sloshing mugs, no dramatic offers scrawled on parchment with wax seals. Instead, you find a piece of wool ribbon tied around a dead tree branch, or a single chicken feather damp with rain left on the step outside a city bathhouse. You notice it because you were taught to notice. You wait a day, then another. Then you go to the grain merchant's stall, pay for nothing, say the word heavy, and walk away. That was your confirmation. A contract has been made. And assassins rarely met their clients face to face. In most cases, an intermediary handled the arrangements. It could be a laundress, a monk, a money changer, someone whose own work gave them reason to speak with many people without drawing attention. The client would not speak in direct terms. Instead, they'd speak in metaphors. There's a weed in the garden. Or my cousin has been struggling under a heavy burden. It would be a kindness to ease it. The intermediary understood. They passed it along. And the price was set. Payment varied widely. Coins were common, of course. Gold, silver, or copper, depending on the target's rank. But sometimes it was land, a mule, a forged document, access to a locked building. In more covert circles, favors were the currency. Kill one man now, receive safe passage out of the city later. Deliver a message to a rival, and one day you'll be spared the noose. In this world, nothing was free, but everything had a price. The assassin would receive details in fragments, rarely a full name. Instead, clues. A man who limps, wears purple on feast days, leaves mass before the final prayer. You had to confirm the identity yourself, to follow, to observe, to be sure, because the client would not take responsibility if the wrong man died. Only you would. Sometimes the target was never killed. A threat was enough, a dagger left on a pillow, a wax seal broken and resealed with a different crest, a shadow in a corridor where no shadow should be. These were called whispers, and they could change a noble's behavior faster than any decree. But when the kill was required, the terms were strict. No witnesses, no mess, no suspicion. If you failed to meet these conditions, you might still be paid, but you'd never be trusted again. And in this world, being trusted meant being allowed to live. Odometer contracts could be called off at the last moment. A ribbon changed color, a symbol scratched out on a city wall, a door left open instead of closed. These were signs: do not proceed, and if you ignored them, the client would not protect you, because protection was part of the deal, but only if you followed the code. There were rules even among killers. Don't kill clerics unless permitted. Don't kill within a sanctuary. Don't harm a child ever. And don't kill another assassin unless contracted to. These rules weren't moral, they were strategic. Breaking them meant attracting too much attention. And attention, in this line of work, was death. Sometimes an assassin became a broker themselves. They knew the trade. They knew who could be bought. And they had built a reputation. A name spoken only in markets, in kitchens, in places where nobles rarely listened, but servants always heard. They were feared, not for killing, but for knowing who wanted someone dead. That was the most valuable currency of all. Segment 23. The Fade. How assassins disappeared after the deed. The deed is done. The room is quiet now. You leave the body as it fell, neatly, exactly as planned. You don't run, you walk. Every footstep has been practiced. Every door you pass through has been measured for sound, for light, for escape. You do not look behind you. You've already seen it all, now you vanish. The assassin's greatest strength was not the kill, but the exit. And medieval cities were perfectly designed for those who knew how to slip away. Winding alleyways, unlit lanes between butcher shops and bakeries, storm drains wide enough to crawl through if you were quiet and small enough to fit. The city that bustled by day became a maze of secrets by night, and the assassin knew every twist of it. Weird, in the minutes after a kill, you used confusion, shouts. Let them come. Guards running one way. You go the other, unslowly, deliberately, like a man looking for his lost mule. You change your cloak, you wipe your face. You walk with a limp or suddenly without one. You become someone else before anyone thinks to describe you. There were safe houses, placed like invisible stones in a path. A wine cellar who owed you a favor. A washerwoman who kept a back room behind the boiling tubs. A healer who stitched wounds no one spoke of. These were not friends, just pieces in a trade of silence. You slipped inside, you waited. Sometimes for hours, sometimes days. Until word came, quiet and coded, that it was safe to move. Then came the crossing. Out of the city. Past the guards at the gate who looked for nervous eyes and bloodied hands. But your hands were scrubbed raw with vinegar. Your cloak smelled faintly of rosemary and pig fat, enough to mark you as a tanner's apprentice. Your papers were forged, or stolen, or granted long ago by someone who now lived with a knife in their chest. You nodded to the gatekeeper, and you passed through. Outside the city there were inns, small ones, quiet ones. Never visited twice, there you changed again. A woman became a widow, mournful and veiled. A man became a friar, shaven and meek. You burned the cloak, buried the weapon, scraped the mud from your boots and rubbed in different soil. You did not speak unless required. Even then, only in a borrowed accent. Disappearing wasn't one act. It was a series of choices, each one erasing part of who you'd been the night before. You changed your name, you lied about your birthplace. You invented a new scar, a limp, a brother waiting in a different town. And in time, you believed it too, because survival required more than silence. It required forgetting. Some assassins stayed mobile forever, never sleeping in the same bed twice, never returning to the place of the kill. Others had a permanent mask. A second life, established, practiced, and maintained. Perhaps they were a bookseller now, or a monk in a distant monastery, or a midwife known for her soft hands and lack of questions. Beneath the surface, the killer remained, but you would never know. And always the assassin listened. For rumors, for names, for word of someone asking questions they shouldn't, and if such a person appeared, they would disappear next, quietly, completely. Because for the assassin, the true art was not killing, it was continuing. Segment 24, The Shadow and the Story, Assassins in Medieval Folklore. There's a tale told in the wine shops of Avignon, about a man with no face, or rather a man with every face. He arrived at feast days and funerals. He could walk through a cathedral without touching the ground, and when he pointed a finger, someone always died. No one could agree on his name, only that he wore no shoes and never looked behind him. He was a real man once, perhaps, but now he's a legend. You assassins who were never caught, never seen, or whose work was too perfect to understand often slipped into folklore. Their identities were erased, so people filled in the gaps with invention. They became phantoms. They drank wolf's blood. They cast no shadow. They were protected by witches or guided by demons or blessed by saints depending on who was telling the tale. In parts of Bohemia, farmers spoke of the Red Hood, a figure who would appear only during eclipses. They said he killed not for gold but to restore balance. No one ever described his face, only the blood-stained fabric he left behind. Of course, historians believe there was no such figure. But 3 murders occurred, each during lunar eclipses, each with the victim's coin purse untouched. Coincidence, perhaps, but the story lasted. In the Alpine valleys, children were told of the Stairs woman. She came in silence and lived among the rafters of castles. Her feet never made a sound, and if you heard soft creaking above your bed, you were already marked. This was likely a memory of a real female assassin, one who posed as a servant and used attics and stairwells to pass unseen. But over generations, the story changed. She grew taller, her eyes turned red, and she became a warning for misbehaving children. The assassin became a ghost. Some stories were deliberately created by assassins themselves. If you were successful, your power wasn't just in skill. It was in reputation. A whispered name could paralyze a household. A sigil carved into a doorframe could cause a noble to double their guard. So you let rumors grow. You left clues behind: a feather, a dried rose, a gold coin with the face scratched off. These became your signature, and soon you didn't have to kill as often. Your name killed for you. Monarchs learned to use this too. A king in Naples once spread false stories of an elite assassin loyal to his crown. A hand of justice that struck from the dark. He didn't have such a man, but he didn't need to. Because once the nobles believed it, they acted carefully. They watched their words, they stopped plotting. The idea of an assassin was more effective than the reality. Over time, even the church participated. They recast some assassins as penitent sinners, men who turned from sin and took holy orders. Others were rewritten as devils sent to punish heretics or tempt saints. The truth was blurred, and in the absence of certainty, story took its place. Some historians believe that famous medieval devils, like the Grey Monk of Siena or the Fanged Pilgrim of Antwerp, were actually assassins, remembered through the lens of fear and superstition. Their blades became claws, their stealth became magic, their anonymity became inhuman, because no normal person could move like that. No normal man could kill without leaving a trace. It had to be something more. And so long after the assassin was gone, their image remained, not as history but as myth. In the space between memory and nightmare, between fact and warning, between the man with a blade and the monster beneath your bed. Segment 25. The End of the Road. A life spent in silence. There comes a night when you do not run. Not because you are safe, but because you are tired. Your body still moves with grace, but now it aches afterward. The knees remember the jump. The back remembers the climb. You've survived what few ever do. Decades of being hunted while you hunted others. But it leaves its mark. Not on your face, which is always changing. Not in your name, which is never real. But deep in your chest, where the silence lives. When no assassin retires openly. There is no final ceremony, no pension. No house with a red door and a garden full of herbs. If you're lucky, you disappear into a quiet trade. You mend shoes, you keep bees. You copy manuscripts for monks who never ask why your Latin is so precise. You choose a name that no one else uses. You tell people you were once a sailor, or a soldier, or a man who lost everything in a fire. You are always someone who's come from somewhere else, and no one ever visits. At night you dream, not of the kills, those are long buried. You dream of doors, of footsteps behind you, of corridors where you can never quite reach the end. And sometimes you wake up holding a knife you thought you had hidden. It's always there somewhere, even when it's not. Regret? Not in the usual sense. You don't mourn the faces. You trained yourself not to look at them. But sometimes you wonder about the life you might have had, if someone hadn't offered you that first job. If you'd taken the coin to carry messages, not blades. If you'd walked the market as a merchant instead of a shadow. If you'd let someone know your real name. Some assassins tried to leave written confessions. A few were found tucked into monastery walls, rambling scripts in rough Latin or clipped French, telling no one in particular about a life spent on rooftops. These were never signed, and maybe they were lies. But the details were always too specific to be fiction. A door with a loose hinge behind the bishop's hall in Lyon. A man who whistled once before dying. A child who recognized them and said nothing. Flickers of humanity in a life meant to erase it. And in the end, no one built statues of them. No songs were sung, no tombs marked. They passed away as they lived and without noise, without applause. In some cases, they died in bed. In others, they simply vanished from the record, as though they'd never been there at all. But you know better. You've walked with them now, heard the rhythm of their steps, felt the weight of a life measured in shadows and breath. And so we leave them here, not as heroes, not as monsters, but as people, shaped by need, used by power, forgotten by history, and remembered only in whispers. They were never meant to be known. But for a little while you've known them. Now rest easy. The night is quiet again. The rooftops are empty. The blade is sheathed. The footsteps have stopped. And there's nothing left to fear. Sleep well. We'll meet again in another time. In another forgotten corner of history.